So what should the Finance Minister be focusing on to try and stimulate the economy? Andrew Duvenage is the Managing Director at NFB Private Wealth Management and joins me now for a conversation ahead of that budget speech. So, Andrew, it would seem some of the key vital signs are starting to beep, albeit, faintly at this particular point. What am I talking about? The GDP figures are starting to slowly come back to life. And also we are told that the numbers in as far as the debt to GDP situation are starting to shape up a long way off from the picture we want. What are your expectations ahead of this speech by Minister Godongwana?
Yeah, so the first thing is I think that the metrics look better as a result of the size of the economy being basically recalculated. But what we'll be interested to see is what is the trajectory of the trend? Is it just going to be a continuation of what we were seeing, where we were getting more and more indebted and really, really struggling? Or are we starting to turn the corner? So I think the minister today, there are three sort of focal areas. The first will be around, is he going to continue with the previous Minister Mbowene's fiscal consolidation approach? And we know that Mr. Mboweni was incredibly unpopular as a result within the alliance, and he's no longer here. So does the new minister continue with this, or is there lip service to it? Because that's obviously important. The second issue is how he navigates the social and political pressure that he's going to be feeling. Is with massive unemployment in this country and so many desperate people, is the demands for social support in the form of grants, a basic income grant, etc., is going to be there, and it's going to be difficult to get away from that. But the problem is that it costs money, and where does the money come from, and how does that go back to fiscal consolidation? The public service wage bill is also an ongoing elephant in the room, where the previous minister had said that he was going to rein that in significantly, and yet during the course of the year there was a degree of capitulation around it. So how the new minister navigates those pressures will be difficult. And in the context of us having collected more tax than expected this year, it's quite difficult to defend against those things. But for me, the fundamental issue, and this is where the whole problem arises from, is around growth. Is South Africa's problem has been that the economy has simply not grown enough to support its spending needs. And the question will be going forward, how much money is directed to long-term economic generative initiatives? And at the moment, it's too little because of the competing priorities. Is if one looks at some of the estimations, whether it's from the Reserve Bank or the IMF, is next year economic activity or economic growth slows to somewhere around 1.8 to 2.2%, and then the year after to 1.3 to 1.7%. And if that's the reality, we're in trouble. Is the minister has to focus on how do we grow the economy, how do we broaden the tax base, and not just from the mining sector, how do we see meaningful economic growth, because that's the only way that they deal with the ticking time bomb, which is unemployment, poverty, and social challenges, as well as addressing the long-term structural issues which in the fiscus, which we're dealing with now.
On that last score that you just raised now, Andrew, around growth, stimulating and ensuring that we start seeing growth in our economy, his efforts, and I suppose government's efforts in general, are not helped by the fact that one of the key sectors is underperforming around electricity, and that's one of the key inputs that you need, right?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, the big ticket items, if you look at the constraints, whether it's our rail network, our road network, general infrastructure, electricity, those are not quick fix items. I think that's the reality. And as much as we'd love to see the minister wave a wand and tomorrow load shedding's gone, that's not going to happen. So they need to start on those things. But outside of that, for me, it's an ideological shift that's needed away from the sort of concept of state-led economic recovery to state-enabled economic recovery. And that is to say that the state shouldn't be the employer of choice, the financier of choice, the growth generator of choice. Rather, they need to focus around efficiency, policy certainty, stability, enabling business, because it will be business which helps generate jobs, create this economic growth. And that's potentially where we're going wrong, in that in previous budgets and medium-term policy statements, these items have all been touched on, but the execution and implementation of them just hasn't come through. And that will be the shift that needs to take place if we're actually going to see meaningful growth, because realistically, South Africa needs to see 3, 4, 5, 6% growth numbers consistently into the future if you're going to deal with these fundamental challenges that we have as a country.
On the revenue side, Andrew, what's your thinking around issues of whether or not we will see any major taxation adjustment, tax adjustments and so forth, but also the question of how sustainable this, I heard someone using the word bonanza, of this 38 billion rand extra that SARS was able to raise in the context of, better performance of some sectors and taxation thereof.
So typically in a medium-term policy statement is you don't see significant tax changes. That's typically the domain of the actual budget speech in February. So we're not really anticipating huge changes at the moment outside of maybe some confirmation on the recent tax legislation amendment bill. But the point that you raise around this additional tax revenue that was collected is a very, very important thing. Is if you look at the economy on aggregate, and you can look at a range of metrics, is things like manufacturing, retail sales, hospitality, mining production in terms of output, construction. Those have all moved sideways and are probably still slightly below their pre-COVID levels. Where we've seen this tailwind, which is most welcome, and we're thankful as South Africans for it, is in receipts from high commodity prices. The challenge with that, and where the minister has a very fine line that he needs to sort of navigate, is that if we become reliant on this windfall from high commodity prices and you start spending that money on things which become recurrent expenditure items, right, is if that tailwind slows down, and what we mean by that is if commodity prices start to cool as global growth starts to slow after the bounce post-COVID, is what happens if your tax revenue now suddenly starts decreasing and you don't have this bonanza and this windfall, and all of a sudden you've baked into the cake, so to speak, a whole range of expenditure items which won't go away, and then you go back into the space of deficits, and that creates fiscal challenges. At the same time, it's difficult for the minister when you're collecting excess tax to turn around and say to the public servants is there's no more money for you. To say on the social grant side of things is sorry, we can't do anything more over there. So it's a very, very difficult space that he's in a way, but we will take the windfall that we've had. It's just, it will be interesting to see whether they can navigate that without actually painting themselves into the corner going forward. And once again, coming back to our conversation on growth, is ideally what you want to see is improved tax revenue on the basis of broad-based recovery and broad-based economic activity.
Yeah.
The Reserve Bank, there is a risk that if these windfalls of performance come just from the mining sector, is then you become very, very sensitive to commodity prices, which is great when things are going well. If it turns against you, is you can have a problem.
Andrew Duvenage, I've really enjoyed your insights here on all angles. It's a pity that we sort of have these conversations cyclically, in that we only have them when there's a budget or medium-term budget speech that is being delivered. But I believe these are conversations that ordinary South Africans should be having all the time. That is Andrew Duvenage there, who was giving us inputs ahead of the medium-term budget policy statement by Minister Enoch Godongwana.